communication, there are several kinds of barriers we face in the process of communication. Communication is a very complex process, particularly in a country like India. Why it is complex in a country like India? Because of the diversity and the plurality we have in India. Communication becomes a challenging process. That is where we need to get a comprehensive understanding about how do we go about overcoming the barriers for communication. The purpose of communication is to be effective. The purpose of communication to be efficient. And the purpose of communication is to be successful. Successful because people have to use the information you have disseminated. That is where it becomes important for us to identify what are the various rules through which we can overcome barriers in communication. If we can understand these rules and principles to overcome barriers in communication, we can effectively, efficiently, and successfully communicate. Let me first identify what are the cardinal rules, what are the basic principles for overcoming barriers in communication. I would like to identify 7 factors, and later I would like to explain these 7 factors which are important for us to overcome barriers in communication. Number 1, plan and clarify ideas. Number 2, create a climate of trust and confidence. Number 3, time your message carefully. 4, reinforce words with action. 5, communicate efficiently. 6, clarity in message. 7, purposeful communication. We must always test our ideas before we go about communicating to people. How do we go about testing? We need to find out whether the ideas are good, that ideas are going to be acceptable, that ideas are useful and relevant to the people or to the target audience we are communicating. When we are talking about planning and clarifying ideas, one of the important things we can do is to collate ideas or suggestions of others so that we can find out what is the prevailing opinion, what is the acceptable opinion, what is the acceptable idea, so that we can go about communicating. There's nothing wrong in terms of trying to meet people or trying to discuss with people, or maybe read some literature and books, get some ideas, find out what is useful in terms of field situation, find out the field reality, so that we can go about planning and clarifying ideas. And as we've been talking about, it's also important for us to clarify our ideas. You need to formulate your ideas very clearly. That's an important, as long as we do not do our message planning, as long as we do not pay attention to what is that we are going to communicate, it will become very difficult for us to communicate. That is where it is important that we need to plan and clarify our ideas. Then the other important aspects when we talk about how to go about overcoming communication is listening. A good listener is a good communicator. Most of the time we do not pay attention to, we do not listen. Good listening is an important quality for effective communication. We can overcome one of the major barriers by being a good listener. An important factor in terms of communication, in communication we are trying to clarify. We need to clarify doubts of people. We need to clarify certain assumptions they have, certain notions they have. That is where it is important in terms of clarification. We must know the receiver. As long as we do not know the receiver or the target audience, we will not be in a position to communicate effectively. We can overcome the barrier to communication by knowing the receiver. The receivers vary from region to region. Receivers vary from one place to another place. The receivers are quite varied. They're quite diverse. They live in different kinds of diverse cultures. So we need to have, a total understanding, a complete understanding of the receiver. Once we know the receiver, we'll be in a position to overcome and communicate effectively. Create a climate of trust and confidence. The basic purpose of communication is to win trust and confidence of the people for whom we are communicating. It is very, very important. As long as we do not win the trust and the confidence of the people, if people are not going to be trusting you in terms of our communication, people are not going to be accepting that message. That's where it is important that we have to win and get the trust and confidence of the target audience for whom you are communicating. Number 3, time your message carefully. Very important concept in terms of trying to overcome barriers to communication. What are we communicating? Where are we communicating? Why are we communicating? To whom are we communicating? When are we going to be communicating? How are you going to communicate is very, very important. In terms of timing our message carefully, all these elements become very important. All these characteristics of communication become very important when you are talking about timing your message carefully. The 4th important factor, reinforce words with action. What do we mean by reinforcing words with action? We must practice what we preach. It is easy to say something, but are we practicing ourselves? That is important. Practice what you preach becomes important. Let me give an example here why Mahatma Gandhi became an outstanding personality in the world. He is one of the greatest personalities we have produced in India. And today his ideology is all over the world. Why do people follow his ideology? Because Mahatma Gandhi practiced whatever he preached. Whatever he talked about with the people, he practiced. That is what is important in terms of communication, because we need to establish that kind of a credibility and honesty with people when we go about practicing whatever we have preached. That's an important factor in terms of communication. The 5th important factor, communicate efficiently. What do we mean by communicating efficiently? Communicating efficiently would mean use feedback. The process of communication is not complete. To overcome one of the barriers of communication, we need to know. We need to get feedback of the people. How successful we have been in terms of communication. In terms of feedback, we also get information why our communication failed. What was the barrier in terms of communication? Why our communication not been successful? We need to get feedback so that we can go about rectifying and communicating more efficiently next time when we plan our communication. Clarity in message. What do we mean by clarity in message? Use of simple and meaningful language. Communication is meant for people. We have to always keep in mind there are people with different kinds of background, different kinds of intellectual levels, different kinds of language levels. So that is where we must try to make our communication as simple as possible and as meaningful as possible. That's where we need to use meaningful language. Because in communication, we are relating with people. In communication, we are trying to empathize with people. And then the 7th important factor is purposeful communication. What do we mean by purposeful communication? Every communication must have a purpose. Every communication must have a goal. Why are we communicating? That is where communication, when we know that this is the purpose of communication, this is why we are communicating, this is the goal of communication, then we'll be in a position to communicate much more efficiently and much more effectively. So we need to take into consideration these 7 important characteristics in terms of trying to overcome communication. The purpose of communication is to establish interpersonal relationship. What are we doing in communication is to establish a rapport, to establish an understanding. In communication, we are trying to establish a mutual understanding. One of the important quality we need to have, are we communicating to establish, interpersonal relationship with our audience? Are we trying to relate, to their information needs? Becomes very important in communication. That's where, as long as, the whole communication process itself, is not complete, as long as, we do not get, the right kind of a feedback. We need to do certain amount of research to find out, yes, we have communicated, we have disseminated our message, we made an effort of, trying to communicate as effectively as possible, but then how did people understand? Was there any misinterpretation? Was there any wrong interpretation? Was there any miscommunication? Most of the time, we say we have communicated efficiently, we have communicated effectively, but then audience did not understand the way we want them to understand. There's nothing wrong with the audience. We have not paid, the sufficient kind of attention in terms of, trying to communicate. So that is where we need to get, feedback, becomes an important factor. When we get, feedback, we can go about changing our strategy, changing our message, changing our media plan to communicate effectively, because only when we do feedback studies, we will be in a position to get that kind of a insight. When we get that kind of an insight, we can modify our communication process. Then, second factor, we must have patience in terms of listening. Others are communicating, we must have patience in terms of trying to listen. Make an eye contact. Body language is important in terms of communication. Gestures are important. If you can straight into the eyes of the person with whom you are communicating, communication is going to be more effective. He will pay attention, or she will pay attention in terms of communication. Show interest. You must have first motivation to communicate. The communicator must show interest. When you show interest, then the audience are also going to evince, the same kind of interest. If you do not have, the sufficient kind of enthusiasm, sufficient kind of zeal to communicate, your audience are also not going to be showing, the same kind of interest. So first, you must have that enthusiasm, you must have that motivation, you must have that interest to communicate, so that, your audience will try to cooperate with you. The other important factor is you must always look attentive. We must, be attentive in terms of what we are saying, what others are saying. We must pay attention. Communication is a two-way process. Communication is from the sender to the receiver. And we also should know how receivers are reacting to our messages. And another ability we need to develop in terms of overcoming barriers to communication is to concentrate on whatever we are saying. Only when we concentrate, when we show interest, when our body language shows that, we are interested in what we are saying, then, we can expect, people to concentrate. We must also concentrate. And one of the important things in terms of communication is to ask questions. Question and answers is a good technique in terms of communicating, because you get, immediate feedback. All the time, you're only speaking for about, maybe for 20 minutes or 30 minutes, without, taking in any questions. If there's anyone, in the audience, anyone, with the people, with whom we are communicating, if he or she raises an hand and seeks a clarification, and you must have that kind of an open mind to answer their questions. So what is important is, in terms of communication, is to have an open mind. You need to completely avoid your prejudices and biases. A communicator should never have prejudices and biases. A person can make it out when we are communicating that you yourself, have a closed mind. So you need to have an open mind. So in terms of, effective communication, you should not be over talkative, you should not be impatient, you should not give a feeling that you know everything, you should not be very critical, and if you have poor concentration yourself on what you are saying, there is a communication breakdown, because you yourself are not concentrating on what you are saying, and you cannot expect, people to listen to you. So that is where it is very, very important There is difference between listening and hearing. We need to make a distinction between listening and hearing. Listening is an important quality in terms of effective communication. Inability to listen accurately. You yourself, as a communicator, I am not in a position to listen, then there is a breakdown in terms of communication. So the factors that help in terms of listening, one needs to have intelligence. Second, you also should have verbal competence, and you yourself should have the motivation. You must have the motivation so that we can overcome some of the barriers in terms of communication. One of the important characteristics or features which are required for a communicator, you need to have a wider perspective so that you can appreciate and express different viewpoints. You need to have wider knowledge. Knowledge is very important for a good communicator. You must have complete understanding about what you are saying, complete command over the subject on which you are speaking. Not only you have a complete understanding about, you need to have wider perspective on various kinds of issues. That is where competence of the speaker is important. The sense of mastery over the subject is important, and one of the important qualities for a communicator is to have greater objectivity. If you are subjective in your ideas, in your information, people are not going to be accepting it. How factual are you in terms of your presentation? How objective you are? How fair and balanced you are in terms of your opinions or in terms of your viewpoint? That you need to make sure. And another important quality for overcoming barriers in terms of communication is to have open-mindedness. We need to be open-minded so that we will be in a position to accept all ideas. So that is where it is important that a communicator must have a positive attitude. When you have positive attitude, you are giving that kind of a positivity to your audience. They will be in a position to accept your information. And another kind of a technique which can follow is question and answer technique. After about 10 minutes or so, if you have spoken, you can always say that, are there any questions? I am willing to take those questions. If you, as part of your presentation, as part of your lecture, if you say that, well, I am willing to take some questions, which you're already giving a feeling to your audience that you are willing to, and you have an open mind. Not that they have to accept your perspective, not that they have to accept your ideology, your viewpoint. In other words, you are telling them, I am trying to take your questions so that well, if you do not agree with my viewpoint, if you do not agree with my perspective, if there is any other kind of a perspective, an alternative perspective, you are willing to accept it. That is where it is important when you have open mind, when you pose question and answers in terms of your lecture, you give that kind of a feeling to your target audience. I would like to give some 10 principles to overcome barriers to communication. These 10 principles are quite crucial to overcome barriers to communication. And it is important that all of us have to practice these 10 principles to overcome communication. Number 1, clarify ideas before attempting to communicate. Before you really communicate to your target audience, you need to clarify ideas yourself before. Are they clear? If the idea is not clear to you, it is not going to be clear to the audience. That is where it is important to clarify ideas before attempting to communicate. Number 2, what is the process of communication? What kind of a message you have? What kind of a medium you're going to be using, or what kind of a channel you're going to be using? What kind of audience you have for communication? The process of communication should be understood very lucidly and clearly. And understanding the physical and human environment when communicating. We must understand the physical and human environment. There are physical conditions, the human environment we need to understand when we are communicating. In planning communication, we need to consult others. There's nothing wrong in terms of trying to consult others how we should go about communicating, what kind of a content we need to communicate, what is the nature of information we need to communicate. Is our information heavily loaded? How much we can communicate? You can consult others. We need to obtain support of others in terms of take the help of others in terms of trying to gather some information, gather some facts, do necessary research, then we can go about communicating effectively. Number 5, consider the content and the overtones of the message. Content is an important element in the communication process. Whether audience are going to understand communication the same way you want them to understand. And it's important that communication has to be effective. All communication needs to have follow-up. It is not adequate we have communicated today and then we forget about it. We need to follow it up. We need to again plan the message. Follow-up activity is important in terms of communication. Communication also has, messages should have short-term goals and then you have long-term goals. If you are talking about a major rural development program or a major pulse polio program, or if you are talking about AIDS awareness in a country like India, then what are your short-term goals? What is your immediate target? What is your long-term target? And depending upon that, you go about planning your communication. And it is important in terms of communication, the 9th element, communication, action must be synchronizing with communication. Action is important in terms of communication. Ultimately, the purpose of communication is to see that there is action. And the 10th important factor in terms of a very important principle in terms of to overcome barriers in communication should be a very effective, efficient listener. You must listen. Communication is in listening. If we can adopt some of the basic rules and principles and features we have identified, we will be in a position to overcome communication. So let me briefly summarize whatever we talked about, whatever we discussed in terms of overcoming barriers to communication. The major factors we have identified is to plan and clarify ideas. Number 2, create a climate of trust and confidence. Time your message carefully. Number 4, reinforce your words with action. Number 5, communicate efficiently and effectively. Number 6, clarity in message. And then communication must have a purpose. All communication is goal oriented. All communication is target audience specific. All communication is culture specific. All communication is people specific. That is where if we can adopt some of the basic principles we talked about, we will be in a position to overcome barriers to communication and effectively communicate, efficiently communicate, so that people will be in a position to accept our messages and then change, attitude, innovation can be brought about in people and then in the larger context of our society.